They called her a paper soldier the moment she stepped through the door, whispered it with smirks and knowing glances, like she'd fought more email threads than actual enemies, more keyboards than insurgents. But when the tape on her wrist slipped, and the major caught a glimpse of the 9 singed-in kill marks inked just below the bone, the air shifted. She hadn't meant to show them off. Hell, she hadn't said a word. But the silence that followed wasn't born of politeness. It was recognition, because those weren't rumors, and she wasn't just a name from a briefing file. She was the reason half their rotation was still breathing. Want to know what those marks really meant, and how 3 arrogant reservists learned the hardest lesson of their military lives? Hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The sun was still crouched behind the fence line when Sergeant Lorna Briggs pushed open the double doors of Building 9. The gym at Fort Brennan hit her with that familiar mix of bleach, sweat, and military-grade routine, the smell of discipline and deferred dreams. It was the same across every base, from Bragg to Benning. Same hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Same cold white glare that made everyone look either 10 years too young or a decade too old. Never accurate, never forgiving. Briggs was 42, and she moved like she'd earned every mile of it. Every scar, every step. Her gait had the kind of understated control that came from decades of putting her weight only where it counted. Her hair was pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail under a washed-out army cap. The PT shirt she wore was so faded you could barely see the logo anymore. The material, soft and threadbare in patches, still held the ghost memory of once perfect creases. Her boots weren't parade ground polished, but they were broken in like a second skin shaped by terrain. That never made it into any training manual. She didn't swagger, didn't posture. There was no need to. Briggs walked like someone who didn't have to prove a damn thing, and that alone made her stand out in a place like this. Behind the front desk, Corporal Martinez barely looked up. His fingers moved across a tablet with the detached efficiency of someone clocking weekend duty and counting the hours until chow. Dust floated in the angled morning light, hanging like soft shrapnel in the stale air. Somewhere in the background, a radio sputtered out the day's duty roster. "Sign INS electronic now," Martinez muttered, gesturing to a fingerprint scanner that looked like it had seen more years than funding rounds. "Press your thumb. Wait for green." Briggs stepped forward, pressed her thumb to the pad. The scanner flickered, then turned green. Martinez's brows furrowed as he scanned the screen. Her name lit something half buried in the back of his mind. Recognition without clarity. "You on the sparring roster?" he asked, voice laced with a flicker of confusion. "They told me I was cleared," she replied. Not defensive, not proud, just a statement of fact. He scrolled again, didn't find anything to flag, and eventually shrugged. "Main floors open, gear checkouts to the left." She nodded once, swung her duffel onto her shoulder, and moved through the checkpoint. Her boots echoed on the concrete for a few beats before the base's morning rhythm swallowed the sound. Inside, sunlight spilled through the high windows, casting rectangles of amber across the sparring mats. The air was cool here, pushed around by fans that sounded like distant helicopters. The rubber mats still smelled faintly of last night's disinfectant, overused, underdiluted. Steel clanked rhythmically from the weight benches as a few early birds lifted through routine like they were checking boxes, not pushing limits. 3 reservists, Spence, Toiver, and Darren, stood near the benches, late 20s, fit in that Instagram way, all swagger, all aesthetics. They had the confident posture of men who'd never had to carry a bleeding comrade off a burning convoy, whose strength had never been tested by anything more dangerous than a time trial. Spence was the first to notice her. His gaze slid over her with idle interest, like she was a curiosity rather than a person. Well, he said, elbowing Toiver. "New blood, or somebody's mom took a wrong turn at the commissary." Toiver grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Logistics, for sure, but she's got a spreadsheet for her push-ups." Darren chuckled, mid-bicep curl. "Definitely certified in Word and WPM. Paper soldier all the way." Their laughter was easy, unbothered, the careless kind that assumes the subject won't hear, or worse, won't matter. It blended with the background noise, iron on iron, breath on breath. life humming along on autopilot. Briggs said nothing, just set her duffel down in a far corner, unzipping it with the same deliberate control she brought to everything else. From it, she pulled out her wraps, plain black, frayed at the edges, seasoned by years of sweat and repetition. No flashy brand, no bright colors, just cloth that knew its job. She began wrapping her wrists with the calm of someone winding a ritual into muscle memory. Her fingers moved slow, precise. There was no rush, no need to look around, no performance to give. The tape slipped once, and that's when the Major saw them. The marks, 9 of them, burned into the inside of her wrist like someone had kept score with fire. And just like that, the room shifted, because now they weren't looking at an older woman in a faded tee. They were looking at her, the one from the reports, the one whose file had redacted lines and battlefield commendations. Most people only read about in fiction. No one made a joke after that. The silence wasn't out of guilt. It was respect. And for the 3 loudest men in the room, it was the first moment they truly realized. Some people walk through hell. Others walk out with the devil's tally burned on their skin. Asterisk. She moved with a practiced efficiency, every loop placed with exact purpose, layering her defenses with such fluidity it seemed instinctual. So automatic she could have done it blindfolded. As she adjusted the compression sleeves on her forearms, the fabric shifted just enough to reveal something beneath. Not tattoos, not decorative flourishes, but something far more deliberate. Thin vertical lines, uniform, precise, and burned into her skin with the kind of permanence that spoke not of vanity, but of ritual, of meaning earned the hard way. Spence noticed, his gaze narrowed, trying to make sense of what he'd glimpsed. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice dripping with the kind of forced friendliness that tried too hard to hide its contempt. "This isn't exactly your local seniors Tai-Chi group." Briggs didn't even pause in her movements. She kept working, her focus undisturbed. "Good," she said, her voice low but clear, slicing through the ambient noise like a scalpel. "Those are usually too easy," Toiver chuckled, but the sound lacked the swagger it had carried earlier. "All right, cute, but this is Kumbiv's training, not chair yoga." She finished wrapping her left wrist, moved seamlessly to the right. Still no hesitation, still that silent, automatic grace. "I wasn't planning to sit," she replied. The words hung in the air, creating a tight pause none of them seemed equipped to handle. A little pocket of silence, just long enough to unsettle. The 3 men traded looks, each waiting for someone else to pick up the thread. The easy mocking tone was slipping. Something about her presence made that harder to maintain. Darren stepped forward, the overcompensating kind of strut that shows up when confidence starts to leak. "Look, no disrespect, but you might be out of your depth here. This isn't beginner's night." For the first time since entering the gym, Briggs looked up, her eyes locked with his steady, unreadable and in that instant, Darren was painfully aware of how young and unsure he sounded. "Then it should be interesting," she said, calmly finishing the wrap on her right wrist. As the compression sleeve shifted again, more of those strange vertical lines appeared. Not random, not careless, each mark equidistant, the width identical, as if etched by a surgeon or a ritualist. Darren caught another glimpse, and something cold settled in his gut. "What's with the wrist art?" he asked, aiming for sarcasm, but his voice came out, thinner than he'd intended. Toiver leaned in slightly, curiosity overtaking mockery. His tone tentative. "Kill count," he said, half joking, but no one laughed. "You binge too much Netflix," Spence offered, trying to pull things back to familiar ground. "That's supposed to give you street cred or something." Briggs stood. Her movements were effortless, deliberate. She looked at them, just for a second, and in that glance was no hostility, no challenge, just a quiet, measuring presence, like she was deciding whether they were worth her time. The 3 men suddenly became aware that whatever this was, they were no longer the ones in control. "When you're ready to find out what they really mean," she said, turning toward the sparring mats, "let me know." The laughter followed her, but it was thinner now, less confident. The way people laugh at a joke they don't understand, hoping it's not about them. Like whizzing past a graveyard they hadn't realized they were walking through. The sparring mats dominated the center of the gym, bordered with regulation tape. Laid down so straight it could have been done with a laser. The surface was pristine too, clean for how often it saw blood and bruises. Around the perimeter was enough space for the inevitable crowd that showed up when egos needed testing. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. Honest light, revealing everything. Briggs stepped onto the mat and began her warm-up. No performance, no flash, just the fundamentals. Jump rope, in an easy, relentless rhythm that spoke of years of muscle memory. Shoulder rolls, neck rotations, deep squats that would have tested athletes half her age. Each motion was purposeful, efficient, like someone used to staying alive in places where readiness was survival, not sport. At the weight bench, Toiver nudged Spence with his elbow. Look at this middle school pay drills. This is gonna be brutal. Spence forced a grin. Probably pulls something just thinking about contact sports. But neither of them sounded sure anymore. From the equipment room, Staff Sergeant Delaney appeared, clipboard in hand, like always the badge of his domain, built like a concrete block, and just as expressive. He'd run this place for 3 years and seen every kind of soldier come through. His instincts were tuned like radar. He could smell trouble 2 reps away. We're opening live sparring rotation, he called, voice carrying across the gym like a bell. Signups are open, light contact only. Respect rank and regulations. Anyone ignoring that can find somewhere else to act tough. Briggs wrapped up her warm-up and walked to the Signup board. She picked up the pen chain to the frame, like all military pens are, and wrote her name. Top of the list. Her handwriting was small, clean, and exact, the kind developed by someone who'd filled out endless forms under pressure, with gloves on. In places where mistakes could cost lives, Delaney glanced at the name, raising an eyebrow. You cleared for this. She met his gaze. No smile, no hesitation, just a calm certainty. Yes, Sergeant. There was nothing performative in the way she said it. No bravado, no defiance. Just fact, quiet, unshakable fact. The kind you only hear from people who've lived through things others can't imagine. They knew exactly what they were capable of and never felt the need to prove it. Spence had wandered over during the back and forth, curiosity pulling him closer until he could read the board over Delaney's shoulder. She actually signed up, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. This should be good. Briggs turned to face him. Her expression remained composed, serene. Even but there was something else in it too. A quiet sharpness, an edge that carried the unmistakable scent of anticipation. Spence, for the first time, felt the undercurrent of something he hadn't planned for. Something real. You're welcome to test whatever theories you've been working on, she said. The words weren't loud or mocking. No bravado, no showmanship. Just a calm invitation laced with such certainty that it landed like a gauntlet at his feet. Spence's grin faltered for a breath, then snapped back into place, though it lacked the bite it had moments ago. All right, Grandma, he said, tossing the nickname out like a lifeline. It didn't land quite the way it had earlier. Delaney glanced between them, suspicion blooming across his face. He looked like a man who just realized the rules of the game were changing mid-play. Don't embarrass the uniform, he muttered, but no one could tell who the warning was meant for. They stepped into the center of the mat, and immediately the contrast between them became apparent. Spence moved like a coiled spring, bouncing on his toes, rotating his shoulders, going through an overly theatrical stretch routine. He was all energy and performance, like someone who'd learned how to fight from YouTube clips and Hollywood sequences, sharp, fast, but hollow at the core. He hadn't been tested where it counted. Briggs didn't move at all. She simply stood still and balanced, her weight perfectly centered, her hands loose at her sides, not tense, not poised to strike, just present, the kind of stillness that whispered of dangerous potential, like a mountain before the quake. Go easy on me, Spence said, flashing a grin that tried to be cocky, but now felt more like a nervous twitch. The timer began. He circled, probing with light jabs, playing the game of range and rhythm. He wasn't looking to land anything serious yet, just gauging her reactions. But she didn't bite. She moved only when necessary, subtle shifts of balance and angle that kept her aligned. always in position, watching him, measuring, logging every detail. Then he lunged a real attack, a hook meant to show off his timing, his precision. And she moved. So quickly, so smoothly, so economically. Later, even the witnesses would disagree about what they'd seen. One moment, Spence was throwing his punch, confident in the geometry of his body. The next, he was flying, his balance shredded by a hip throw that used his momentum against him like a weapon. The impact echoed across the gym, sharp and final. The air left his lungs in a single pained rush. Silence followed. Spence lay there, stunned, staring at the ceiling as his brain tried to rewind and understand what just happened. When he finally sat up and found his feet again, the grin was gone. "Okay," he said, his voice rough and uncertain. "Lucky shot." But even as he said it, he knew better. That hadn't been luck. That had been cold, practiced skill. The kind that came from doing this in situations where the price of failure was blood. They reset. This time, Spence approached with caution. He respected her now, her timing, her reach, her effortless positioning. He switched tactics, opting for brute force, a shoulder charge meant to overwhelm. She slipped to the side like a shadow, hooked his front leg mid-charge, and sent him sprawling again. The fall was controlled, but it ended the same flat on his back, her knee pinning his chest, her grip wrenching his wrist in a way that made his shoulder scream. "Tap," she said, like someone offering tea, not dominance. Spence slapped the mat fast, 3 times. She let go at once, stepping back to give him space. He sat up slowly, clutching his shoulder, trying to reconcile what had just happened. She didn't look like a fighter. She looked like someone's supervisor. But she had just dismantled him, effortlessly. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Delaney looked down at him with a face that said he'd seen this movie before. "That," he replied, "was not beginner's luck." Darren had gone quiet. The smirks were gone. In their place was a rising respect, or at least the beginnings of it. Maybe they hadn't been looking at a pencil pusher. Maybe this woman wasn't here to shuffle files and sip coffee. Briggs walked to the edge of the mat and sipped her water, calm as ever. Her breathing was steady. No sweat, no adrenaline shake. Spence stood, slower this time, and looked at her with a long, searching expression. Something in him had shifted. "You still think she's here for paperwork?" he asked Oliver, but the swagger in his voice had drained away. The atmosphere had changed. Laughter had been replaced by something heavier, a silent recognition that they were standing in the presence of a depth they hadn't seen before. Briggs adjusted the wraps on her wrists with the same care she gave to everything she touched. The compression sleeves slid slightly, revealing again the uniform vertical lines burned into her skin, precise, deliberate, permanent. The lesson had begun, but none of them realized just how much they still had to learn. The gym's main door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Major Kendall Hayes entered. At 54. He moved with a quiet authority forged in places no tourist map ever dared to name. His uniform was crisp, functional rather than flashy, and he carried a clipboard, like it was an extension of his own arm. He paused just inside, scanning the room with a gaze honed by 3 decades of reading tension in people before they even spoke, and he noticed it instantly. Something was different. The usual jokes, the morning noise, the lazy bravado, it was gone. In its place was silence, respect, and the unmistakable air of people who'd just seen the first crack in their understanding of the world. Near the water cooler, Spence sat with a towel draped around his neck, gently working his shoulder like a man trying to convince himself the lesson hadn't been personal. Darren leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching Briggs with the quiet focus of someone no longer sure where the lines were drawn. No one laughed. No one dared. Against the wall, their earlier swagger had given way to something quieter, weariness, maybe even doubt. On the mat, a woman sat calmly, adjusting her wrist wraps with a precision that spoke not of nerves, but of ritual. Each movement was smooth, practiced, the kind of motion that could have been performed in darkness and still been flawless. Hayes stepped up beside Delaney, who was scanning his clipboard with the furrowed brow of someone trying to make sense of something that defied expectations. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, his voice low but firm. The kind of tone that drew attention without ever needing to rise. Delaney handed over the clipboard without a word, eyes still fixed on the mat. Unexpected addition to the sparring list, he muttered. Woman signed herself in, said she was cleared. Hayes's eyes moved down the roster, pen pausing when it hit a particular name. His face didn't betray much, just the faintest flicker of something. But it was enough. Someone who knew how to read people would have seen this shift. The moment recognition landed like a weight. Briggs, he said evenly. Delaney gave a slow nod. Yeah, you know her. Hayes didn't answer right away. His gaze lifted instead, zeroing in on the woman. She was adjusting the wrap on her wrist again, tightening the fabric just slightly, and the motion caused her compression sleeve to slide. A fraction. It was enough. What lay beneath wasn't ink, not the swirling patterns of body art or unique pride. These were lines, clean, vertical, uniform, burned into the skin with precision, each one exactly spaced, each one deliberate. 9 Hayeses. Jaw tightened, a barely perceptible reaction, but it was there. Those marks weren't new to him. He'd seen them in briefings that were redacted before they were even archived, in reports that came with pages missing and eyes-only distribution. They belonged to an era most people only heard about in rumors, an era where certain teams operated under laws written in blood and silence. From across the room, Toiver called out, his voice brash but shaky. She's got those things all over her arms. Real dramatic, like some warrior priestess cosplay or something. The words didn't last long. They hit the air and fell dead, suffocated by the weight of Hayes's attention. When he spoke, it wasn't loud, but it cut straight through the gym's ambient. Noise like a blade. Do you boys have any idea what you're looking at? It wasn't a real question. It was a challenge. Toiver blinked, the color draining from his face as he realized he'd stepped into something he didn't understand. Spence shifted where he stood, the cocky energy gone, replaced by something closer to confusion. Darren busied himself with his laces, avoiding all eye contact. Hayes turned and began walking toward Briggs, his stride calm but purposeful, the way one might approach something dangerous, not out of fear, but respect. Mind if I ask where you're stationed these days, Sergeant? She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Her posture didn't change. No tension, no challenge, just the steady gaze of one professional addressing another. Off the grid. Civilian contractor. Status reinstated 8 months ago. Hayes nodded slowly. The pieces were coming together now. They finally cleared. Your paperwork. Cleared enough to walk back through doors like this one, she said, with a slight gesture toward the gym. Hayes turned back to the trio who had been watching. The casual buzz of the gym replaced by something heavier, the atmosphere thick, with understanding only just beginning to take root. You see those marks? He asked. The ones you were laughing about? He let the question hang, his voice carrying with a weight that pulled the room still. They're not decorations, not something you get to look tough for a weekend seminar. They're not tattoos, they're scar tissue, the kind you earn. He let that sit for a moment longer before continuing. Each one of those lines represents a confirmed elimination, from a mission that doesn't appear in your manuals, from a war that doesn't exist on your training maps. The room fell silent. Even the usual background noise seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Briggs ran point for 3rd Recon Group 7. Deep insertion teams. Black budget work. No attribution. No backup. The kind of jobs where you don't come back unless you finish the job and bury the evidence. Toiver looked stricken. Wait, you mean like real combat? Hayes's tone turned razor sharp. No, I mean real war. The kind where people die if you blink wrong. The kind where mistakes get body counts. He gestured back toward Briggs, whose arms, half revealed beneath the sleeves, still bore those scorched lines. Those 9 marks, that's 9 lives confirmed. 9 people who were breathing when she arrived and weren't when she left. And that's just the ones they let her document. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't one of awe or fear, it was respect. Hard-earned and overdue. ***. A glanced down at his hands, the weight of his weekend warrior worries suddenly feeling embarrassingly light. It hit him this wasn't nostalgia or sentimentality that got her through the door. Hayes's voice cut through the silence with quiet authority. You think they let her sign up because someone got soft? He let that question hang in the air, his gaze sharp as it swept across the three men who had just spent their morning colliding, headfirst with a truth they never saw coming. She's got more confirmed kills than most infantry companies rack up in an entire deployment. He paused, letting the words settle. The woman you've been calling grandma and mocking as a paper soldier has more combat time than all three of you will see even if you serve for the next 20 years and hit every war zone on the map. Briggs had finished wrapping up her gear, methodically sliding each piece into her duffel without so much as a glance at the room. Not once had she raised her voice or defended herself. She didn't have to. The silence around her said more than any list of medals ever could. Darren finally spoke, though his voice was smaller than he intended. We didn't know, no, Hayes replied. You didn't. And that's the first real thing you've learned today. His eyes locked onto each of them. In turn, there was no anger, just a stern kind of clarity. In the military, you never know who you're talking to. That woman at the desk might have dragged wounded soldiers out under fire. That guy fixing your ride could have held a perimeter with nothing but a rifle and grit. And the quiet one in the corner, she might have saved more lives than you'll ever get the chance to. He turned then, looking at Briggs, who was already hoisting her duffel over one shoulder and stepping toward the door. Sergeant, Hayes called, voice edged with respect. She paused at the threshold. Still sharp, he added. Briggs glanced back just briefly, and for the first time that morning, her face broke into the faintest flicker of a smile. Russ was never the problem, she said simply. Then she was gone, walking out without a backward glance, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence that no one moved, no one spoke, not a single attempt to smooth over the discomfort with humor. Because what had happened here wasn't just about getting something wrong, it was about the ground shifting beneath their feet. Everything they thought they knew about strength, experience, and identity had just been turned inside out. It wasn't about embarrassment, it was about revelation. Hayes lingered for a moment longer, his voice softer now. You're going to carry this moment for a long time. The only question is, will it change you? Or will it just become one of those stories you tell your buddies after a few beers? He tucked his clipboard under his arm and walked out, but not before leaving them with a final reminder. Next time you think you know someone based on their age or how they look, remember Sergeant Briggs. Remember those burn marks on her arms. And remember that the most dangerous people in this world are the ones who never need to prove it. The door shut with a quiet hiss, and the three of them were left in the kind of silence that only comes after everything you thought you understood has been cracked wide open. There were no orders now, no drills, just thought, heavy, humbling thought. Outside, Briggs made her way across the parking lot toward her truck, the morning sun at her back casting long shadows behind her. Building 9 looked exactly the same as when she'd entered earlier, but inside, 3 young soldiers had been permanently changed. They had seen someone that defied all their neat little assumptions. They had come face to face with the truth that respect isn't handed out based on appearances or age. It's earned, quietly, relentlessly, one moment at a time. She didn't glance back. She didn't have to. The lesson had landed. Whether they chose to grow from it or not was out of her hands. Some lessons are like that. You can show people the door, but stepping through it is on them. Still, there was something about this kind of lesson, raw, unexpected, personal, that stuck in the mind long after the moment passed. And sometimes that was enough. Ever misjudged someone so completely, only to discover they were carrying a history heavier than you ever imagined? Would you have known what those burn marks meant if you'd seen them? Would you have understood? Let us know in the comments. If this story reminded you that true strength speaks softly but moves mountains, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to keep hearing these real stories of the warriors who walk among us quiet, proud, and powerful in ways that don't need to be spoken. Share this with someone who still thinks they know what a soldier looks like. There's more where this came from. Check out the playlist and meet the legends hiding in plain sight. We'll see you tomorrow, right here on Dignity Defended.